of right. So we are discussing today the infamous, notorious Bengal Famine of 1943. It really began 42 and went through to 44, but 43 was kind of a peak year when, according to different estimations, around 3 million people died of starvation. Of course, there are far more casualties than 3 million deaths. People's lives were wrecked, disrupted, families broke up, people were expelled from their lands, people migrated to cities, and in particular, as always, women were most affected, including prostitution and working in brothels, that sort of thing, exploitation of vulnerable people. So Bengal famine is infamous for many reasons, but let me just kind of contextualize this and link it to our previous discussion. So let's just briefly talk about famines in history. Well, in India, which is our area of particular interest, between 1770 and 1947, at the end of the Raj, there were at least 12 major famines, of which people know about the 1770 Bengal famine, and we know about the 43 famine. But in between, there are other major famines, different names, different places. And I did a quick calculation of these famines for today, and I estimate that in this period, over 60 million people died of hunger. So this is during the Raj, beginning with the British East India Company. They started before 1770, but we're talking about 1770 as the first major famine under the British Raj or the East Indian Company. So around 60 million people have died because of famines. And so let's just say that imperialism and colonization must come with a health warning. It should be on the packet. I would argue that famine is hardwired into the very nature of imperialism. So we can discuss that in a bit. There have been other famines, of course, which are not linked to imperialism as such. There's the famines of the 1930s in Soviet Union, where maybe 8 million people died of hunger because of Stalin's agricultural policies. There's the Chinese famine, the Great Leap Forward, where, depending on who you believe, between 10 and 30 million people died. There have been many others. North Korea in around 55, 58, several million people died. Cambodia in the 1970s, but there have been lots of famines linked to certain regimes. So you can argue, in one sense, the arrangements brought about famines. But today we're looking at famines in relation to imperialism. And the Putniks, who we've been discussing now for several weeks, the Putniks have a distinct view about the cause of famines under imperialism. It's linked to their broad arguments we discussed in previous sessions. But today we're talking about the Bengal Famine of 1943. And the Putniks have written about the Bengal Famine from their particular perspective. So that's what we're looking at today. You would have received from Tom the article which Utsa Putnik wrote in 1917. That article was then reproduced in their latest publication, which is called Capitalism and Imperialism, Theory, History and the Present. And it's also part of the other book called The Theory of Imperialism, which we've also been discussing. So in one sense, the Bengal Famine is a kind of a case example of their account of imperialism. So let's bear that in mind. What was interesting in the 1917 article, which Utsa Putnik wrote, is that she referred to the Bengal famine as a Holocaust. And she compared the 3 million who died in Bengal to the 6 million who died in the Holocaust. She's obviously referring here to the extermination of the Jewish populations of Europe by the Nazis. And strangely enough, this reference disappears in the latest book. We can speculate why, but I think her analogy in any way is incorrect, because more appropriate would have been to refer to the hunger genocide which the Nazis imposed upon Eastern and Central Europe. A deliberate policy of starving to death people of lands they had captured, in particular Ukraine, Belarus, and the Soviet Union itself, as they occupied Eastern and Central Europe. They had a deliberate policy of starving to death its populations, keeping alive only those who were required for slave labor. So this is a well-recorded plan by the Nazis to repopulate Eastern and Central Europe with Germans and let the local population starve to death slowly but surely. It's called the Hunger Plan in German, and a clear example of genocide proper, which is a planned extermination of a people. And I suggest that the Bengal famine is analogous. Quite why Putnik linked it to the Jewish Shoah or Holocaust, I don't quite see the logic of that, unless it was designed to show the murderous intent of the perpetrators. So we're making a distinction here between managing a famine which comes about for whatever reason, through the neglect of the population, allowing people to die from hunger and starvation out of indifference or neglect or incompetence. So the Irish famine of 1845 was actually caused, as we know, by the potato blight, which is a staple diet of most Irish peasants. But potato blight wasn't directly caused by imperialists or colonizers. It was a management of the consequences of potato blight to those many deaths. 1 million people died in Ireland. A third of the population died, and another third emigrated as a consequence. But we can distinguish here between the indifference of a racialized capitalist imperialist mentality. It doesn't matter that non-Europeans, non-whites can die, because don't forget the Irish regarded as non-white at the time. They were regarded as an inferior breed of people. We can talk about indifference, callousness, greed, and of course, the landlord-peasant arrangements which supported capitalists and imperialists. they all lead to starvation during periods of famine. But the point is that, generally speaking, most famines come about because once they start to happen, they are treated with contempt, indifference, callousness, and so on and so forth. So infamously, the Irish famine was left to laissez-faire market economics. That was a deliberate policy of the government at the time. Let the market sort it out. The half-hearted attempts at what's called public relief, people were forced to labour and build pointless roads and canals and that sort of thing in return for relief. There were attempts to manage the famines, but my point is that some famines have come about through a deliberate policy. And in one such case, in Bengal's case, there's a deliberate policy of knowing very well that in pursuit of certain economic strategies, this would lead to widespread famine, and that was to be accepted as a part of the process. Now, the reason why you can have that mentality, implementing economic policy, which is going to ensure mass starvation of vast swathes of the population, you can have that mentality because of racism. Yeah, it is inconceivable that British government would have permitted and planned for the wholesale starvation of its indigenous population in Great Britain. It would be incomprehensible that would have been allowed to happen. But because we're talking about Bengal and we're talking about a racialized construction of the world, the deaths of millions of Bengalis, don't forget the poorest, most dispossessed and impoverished sections of Bengal society, were allowed to starve to death. So this was a deliberate, intended, foreseeable consequence of policies put in place by the British and colonial government at the time. So we're talking here about a quite different set of arrangements, which is the point that the Putniks are making. In other words, the Bengal famine should be described as a genocide. A genocide under international legal parlance, it must involve pre-intended actions. It must be a planned action driven by those who hold power. It must be a conceived and planned implementation of an idea. And this undoubtedly describes what happened in Bengal. It was a set of policies setting in motion the inevitable starvation of millions of people. Even though there were half-hearted attempts subsequently to assuage the effects of famine, there is some relief put into place half-heartedly. There are attempts to manage the process to some extent, but these were insignificant compared to the consequences of a policy put into place with intentionality. So let's bear that in mind. Now, the Putniks in their various articles and chapters explain all this in technical economic terms. So they describe very carefully, somewhat obtusely, unless you've got an economic trained mind, they describe Keynesian economic policy. And they suggest that Keynes himself was instrumental in putting into place this public policy in Bengal, which led to mass starvation. Now, bear in mind, for those of us who've been involved in British politics for some time in the British scene, and also, of course, it's now true in other places like America, is that Keynesian politics is often seen as a kind of solution to the problems of capitalism, insofar as Keynesian politics is linked to state expenditure on infrastructure projects, public spending, the generation of high employment, hence greater productivity. It's designed to kickstart and keep the capitalist system going, but ensuring that the workers, to some extent, receive, quote, their fair share of the profits. In other words, they get a decent wage and so on. So full employment tends to generate higher wages because the demand for workers increases. So it's sometimes described in economic circles as a virtuous circle. Now, those of a Marxist-orientated mind, of course, can criticise Keynes, deconstruct what Keynes did, which was simply to support capitalism, not to actually destroy it. It was a way of the state supporting capitalism, and we get this today, don't we, with massive printing of money, quantitative easing, that sort of thing. It's still around with us, and it can be argued that there's been a turn back to Keynesian economic policies these days to get us through the COVID crisis and so on and so forth. So Keynes himself has a certain special place in leftist politics, but when you look at Keynes in particular, he can be criticised, and the Putniks have looked very carefully at his more obscure writings, and they've discovered, of course, that Keynes had other solutions to economic problems, some of which he applied to India, and this is where the Putniks start analysing the technical aspects of economic policy. I shan't go into that. We can, if people want to discuss the technicalities of Keynesian politics, Keynesian policy applied to India, we can do that. It requires a certain understanding of economics and what's called demand management. But let's set that aside. Let me come back to that if you especially want to. The point is that Keynes posed a question, which was how do you cover the cost of a war? And his solution vis-a-vis India was that India should pay the cost of the war in the East, as it's called, from a British point of view, the war against Japan. India and its population had to bear the costs of the war through various complex economic fiscal policies, above and beyond the normal imperial drain, which we discussed before. The looting of India is one thing that's ongoing under the special circumstances of the war against Japan. Extra fiscal and economic policy put into place designed to enforce the Indian populations to pay for the cost of a war against Japan. And this is what Keynes was trying to find a solution to. And his solution was to what he called introduce profit inflation. Essentially, that is another term they use is forced savings, quote unquote. This is a strange term to use, but what it means essentially is that in wartime, you can have what are called voluntary savings. So people of a certain age may recall scenes in Britain and America where war bonds were sold. Members of the public would pass over their savings and buy war bonds, which would be redeemed after the war. So that's what's called voluntary savings. Their money goes into a war bond to pay for the war. In India, it was forced savings, meaning by that, by covering the cost of a war against Japan, by ensuring profit inflation through the war industries, which sprang up around Bengal. It meant that ordinary people relied upon the market to buy their basic staples, because of the subsequent price inflation, couldn't afford to buy food, and as a consequence, they slowly starved to death. So they were forced to save, in inverted commas, through what's called price inflation. The the price of rice increased sixfold in a short space of time. Other prices rose up 300%. And by allowing inflation to become rampant, partly caused by printing money to pay for all this, people were left without a wherewithal to purchase what they needed, and they slowly starved to death. And there's very limited relief allowed. So not only did a set of policies put into place a pathway to starvation through fiscal and economic policies, in addition to that, there was a lackluster disinclination to even provide relief. There's a small amount of relief provided. It is very, very limited and very, very patchy. Insofar as people were relieved, that was given to people living in urban centres, people involved in the war effort. The government assured that they were fed through rationing and by commandeering supplies of food. In one sense, they were kind of isolated or made immune from the worst effects of starvation. It was the people in the countryside, those so-called petty producers, artisans, peasants, fisher people, those kind of people, landless labourers. Those were the people who were abandoned because of this public policy. And let me just conclude so we can have a broad discussion about all this, is that, of course, we know that Churchill himself, the arch imperialist, he was adamant that no relief should be provided to Bengal. He forbade the import of food to feed people. He ensured that food supplies were sent to Europe in preparation for feeding the European population after the defeat of the Nazis. As he famously said, Indians are a beastly people with a beastly religion. And he said they're starving because of their capacity for overbreeding. So he had these very ugly racist interpretations of this famine. And he knowingly forbade the import of food to India, letting people just die. Some people argue this was his response to the Quit India movement. There had been a growing Quit India movement emerging in the 40s, and some argue this was his revenge for the Quit India movement. We don't need to talk about revenge as such. Let's just call it racism. And as a consequence, millions of people died. So I'll stop there. If you've got any questions about the economics, Tom and I will try and explain that, Keynesian economics, and let's discuss this in the context of imperialism and famines in general.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd like some more clarification because, as I understand what Keynes is, what the Keynesian policy that Usha Patnaik says was applied was to ensure that there was price inflation and but no comparable wage increases, so that the people were basically starved because the prices went up and their income didn't go up, so they couldn't afford to buy food, and as a result, they died from lack of nutrition. Now, what I don't fully understand is the mechanism by which, if this is what actually happened, if it was deliberate policy, and I'm not saying it wasn't, but if it was, what is the mechanism by which you ensure that prices go up? As opposed to just inflation occurring because
well,
wages are rising.
okay, well, my understanding is that this is what's called an aspect of Keynes theory called demand management, which is a kind of a technical term. If in Bengal, which became the epicenter of an arm, a British army or a British imperial army, eventually also Americans, hundreds of thousands of troops being stationed in Bengal to counter the impending Japanese invasion. Of course, Japan got as far as occupying Burma on the Indian border, cutting out, by the way, a supply of rice from Burma, which had been an historical import-export connection. The stationing or garrisoning of hundreds of thousands of troops, and also the commissioning by the government of a vast amount of war industry involving private enterprise being given contracts, increased a vast number of people involved in the war effort. And what the government ensured was that all available supplies of food, because there had been harvest failures for several years and grain production had been going down over several years, is that all available food was brought up by the government for servicing all these army personnel and war industry personnel. So through a process of boards and collecting food and paying for food, it meant that the demand for food went up because food itself didn't increase, and the actual amount of food available didn't increase, but you had a vastly inflated number of people requiring feeding. So those who had the most money could buy up what was available. If demand exceeds supply, then we know this leads to price rises. So this is just basic market economics. Where things are in short supply, then the cost goes up, and those who can afford to pay the highest reap the rewards of their wealth. So this is simply a supply and demand situation, which could have been managed in different ways. Food could have been rationed so the whole population was fed. Food could have been imported from other Indian states, and that was not allowed, especially the princely states. So this is about demand management, and without state intervention to compensate for the rise in cost of food, and those who can't afford to buy it go hungry and die from it. So is that your understanding, Tom? To clarify James's question, how would you put it?
Yeah, can I just add a little bit to that? I think,
Yeah.
Because I didn't read the paper, but I heard a talk by what her name is, Utsa Patnaik, on the making of the Bengal famine lessons for today, and she gave it in 2020. So in that, she's kind of added that Keynes, rather than raising prices in Britain and straining the British population, the idea was you could just do it in India. And put all the burden there, basically, so that there was no extra strain on the finances here. Rather, there was some borrowing also going on from the idea was that you take this loan from India, but you're not going to really return it.
So I haven't mentioned the complexity of the relationship between India and Britain, and how wealth is taken to Britain and back and forth, essentially Britain made India pay for its war against Japan. So that cost was not borne by the British indigenous public; it was borne by India. And one way of managing that cost could have been through taxation of the rich in India, for example. it could have been done through a progressive taxation system, which is what happened in Britain. In Britain, they introduced a progressive tax arrangement, tax regime, so that the more you earned, the more you paid in tax. So it was what's called progressive. So the poorest people in Britain didn't pay tax. So I think if you earned less than £5 a week in Britain in the 40s, then you were not taxed. And those above were taxed. Obviously, there's lots of tax avoidance and so on and so forth. But the point was that the principle of that the cost of the war should be borne by the whole population in a progressive sort of way, so that the poorest sectors of the population were given some degree of insulation from the cost. In the case of Bengal, it was intended that the poorest sections of the community, the petty producers, the peasantry, people who worked on the land, they're the ones who were meant to bear the cost of this war through this process of price inflation. The beneficiaries were, of course, the local entrepreneurs, the agents, the middlemen, so-called. What's that Indian word for it? I forget it. What's it called? There's an Indian word to describe these middle people, these agents. His name escapes me. This is a public policy set in motion, which is very different to Britain. In Britain, for example, inflation during the war was 70%. So from 1939 to 1945, because of supply and demand management, because demand exceeded supply, prices did rise by 70%, which is quite a lot to bear within the space of 5 years. In India, during the same period, it's 300%, 300% in a short period of time. So if the price of rice increased sixfold over a period of a few months, imagine discovering that your 5 rupees can no longer buy any rice at all, whereas before it could. You literally you didn't have enough money to buy things, and there's no other way of getting that kind of food. There's no real relief. So if in effect your money was deflated because of rising prices, and those prices were engineered to rise through this whole policy, fiscal policy, then the outcome is bound to be that people without savings, without money, would starve to death. In fact, what people did, of course, is that smallholders ended up selling their land to raise money. So they become land labourers, and they had to migrate to cities to find work. So even those who survived the famine, of course, lost their livelihoods and their capital, their land holdings, and of course there are knock-on effects. I mean, many landholders couldn't afford to pay rent to the landlords, to the zamindars and so on. As a consequence, they booted off their land. So quite a few people benefited from Bengal famine. The hoarders and the landlords who brought up land cheap, they were beneficiaries to that small number of increasingly wealthy Indians. But the actual war itself was borne by the indigenous peasant population. Tom, have you got anything to add to the economic aspect of that?
No,
What's your understanding?
I think I should read the book, How to Pay for War.
Yeah.
I know about the demand for war and what he discussed in general theory.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of what he has discussed. I have general knowledge how inflation can have a redistribution of income.
Absolutely, yes. And that's, but if it's purposeful, then it's intended. Inflation can happen because demand naturally outgrows supply. But if you set in motion a situation where demand is bound to outgrow supply, if that's what you set in motion, then you're responsible for it. We have the same thing, don't we, even today? I mean, after the 2008 financial crisis, which was sparked off in America but spread to the whole world, most countries introduced what's called austerity. In other words, to pay for the cost of bailing out all the big banks, forced savings, which is what austerity is, was forced upon the general population. In other words, ordinary people bore the cost of bailing out the big banks. So that's an example of deliberate economic fiscal policy being used to sort out a problem. So you can draw kind of analogies. We still have this today. Most indebted countries who get involved in the WTO, their ruling elite takes out vast loans from WTO on conditionalities, which is they privatise public services and so on and so forth. That's also what's called forced savings. If you give away your public services, then people who receive those services are losing a part of their capital. They're being forced to have a reduced standard of living through these processes. So this idea of transfer of wealth from one sector to the other sector is a general principle of capitalism and imperialism. It manifests itself in many different ways. Bengal was one such way it manifested, the enforced transfer of income or wealth from peasantry to capitalism and imperialists. It's the same kind of process, a kind of the key point is that this was a policy knowingly put in place. If you want to read Keynes' 2 books on how to manage a war in detail, then please go ahead. The point is that the general point is that these policies were purposeful and intended, and the consequences were foreseeable, and they were disregarded because those people didn't count, because they were not British or white, though they were non-white, non-British subject peoples, what we call racism. Keynes himself, of course, has some degree of affection in the left in Europe, because in some sense he bailed out, supported the working classes of Europe through his so-called Keynesian economics. But from an Indian point of view, he's not a great saviour at all. You know, Keynes himself was, like any man of his time, was a white supremacist who regarded imperialism and colonies as quite normal and natural, and the disregard of subject populations was perfect for him, perfect, normal and natural. He didn't need to think about it. So this mass starvation of the Bengali population sprang from his racist mentality. He would never apply those policies to Britain. He knew it would not be tolerated. It would not be acceptable. But it was acceptable for him to do it to India. So that's the key point. So you can explore the economic, fiscal policies and theoretical arguments, which the Patniks explain in some detail. And you can read Keynes' books if you wish to understand the technical logic of the whole process. But I'm more concerned about today to stress the outcomes of his thinking.
Okay, Mary, sorry for Mary Wiggins.
This is the first meeting I've attended, so thank you for the invitation and the welcome, and thank you, Paul, for a very lucid introduction. I think what I'm going to say, let me preface it, I don't really know what I'm talking about. I'm just floating some ideas. So I think you're saying— You're
in the right place, then.
Say again?
You're in the right place, then, yeah.
So I think you're saying some of the specificity of the Bengal famine is the fact it's during the war, that it's making India pay for an imperialist war rather than the British population, and using engineering prices to pay for it. And I think if we talk about famines in any period in history, particularly in the period of colonialism and imperialism, there are a lot of similarities. A famine is a famine is a famine. The poor always suffer most, the rich don't. And very often a famine is exploited. It's never let a good famine go to waste when you can use it to change relations of production or whatever. But I just wondered if we put it alongside the Irish famines, there are clearly some similarities and probably a lot of differences. The impact was huge, clearly, 1/8 of the population dying and another quarter perhaps emigrating. And again, it's not the, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I don't think that there was price manipulation during the Irish famine, to my knowledge, but it's still political and economic decisions being made. So the export of food from the colony that is Ireland to the metropole happened. And it was, and monies, landlordism didn't stop, and monies were still sent back to Britain. And there was a similar, I think, racist ideology. Irish people were not black, but they were racialized as black in some cartoons. They were subhuman, they were not civilized. And they were pathetically traditional and incompetent farmers. This is all in inverted commas. And during the famine, you can rationalize agriculture by stopping the increasing diminution of land holding sizes to have bigger, more, I don't think capitalist, but more modern farms. So
More
the things
efficient.
the same are perhaps the brutality of the metropole towards the colonies, dressing it up in racism, different in Bengal, but there's still that thread going through it. And political decisions like the export of food from Ireland, which were, the consequences were known, the consequences, everybody was fine with Irish people dying, Bengalis dying. This is a political decision, also an economic one, and it's I think that is a similarity with Bengal. And you talk, Paul, about the Lebensraum in eastern, in where was it, Ukraine, was it, Belarus, Lebensraum, and that too was a very, that wasn't just we've got good Nazi Germans who can use this land. It was a very racialized policy as well, because Slavs were deemed to be subhuman. So I'm not saying anything at all. I'm just throwing out a few possible comparisons, and I'd like to know.
I think you're making some very good Marxist points, which is that any historical episode has its own unique particularities, but also its similarities. So this is the dialectic, that in differences there are similarities, and in similarities there are differences. So yes, of course, the Irish famine can be explained in terms of all those things you say. Racialised, it was political decisions made in the British Parliament by the British government. It is also down, of course, to land ownership and the arrangements in place between landlords and peasants, and how that relationship was very, very asymmetrical. In fact, it led to what was called the Land League. Out of the Irish famine, of course, you see the emergence of an anti-imperialist movement seeking independence and Irish republicanism and so on and so forth, with O'Connell, so-called Land League. Out of the Irish famine, there emerged the so-called the three Fs: fair rents, free ownership of land, and fair tenancy, to avoid arbitrarily being kicked off your land. So the so-called three Fs movement sought to reform land ownership, because it was land ownership which meant that the potato blight had its effect. I mean, a typical Irish peasant had a very small holding, in which he and his family grew potatoes as a staple diet, because potatoes were the most efficient way of getting food down you. And their small holdings were often on very in fertile land, and they had to work for the landlord and pay that landlord a lot of money for rent and so on and so forth. So all these things have economic and political consequences, and Bengal's no different. The land ownership relationships in Bengal made any famine far, far worse of those at the bottom of the hierarchy. So as you point out, it's the poorest sections of the community, people own their land, who've got very small holdings, who pay high rent, become victims of this process. And yes, of course, there are similarities with Irish potato famine in Bengal, but I don't think it's true to say that although there were in place the situations created by colonization, created by imperialism, it was no plan of the imperialists to actually induce a famine in Ireland. It occurred because of a potato blight, the spread of a disease, which started in America. It came across to Europe. In fact, some people argue that the 1848 revolutions across Europe were cultivated by the potato blight in Europe. People became increasingly hungry, discontented, there's social unrest. And some people argue that the 48 revolutions and failed revolutions in Europe were sprang from this encroachment of potato blight. So they're all connected, but I don't think it's true to say that it was intended to happen in Ireland. It did happen, and people were treated as less than human. We know that. The argument, by the way, that exports from Ireland continued is much debated. It's contested by economists. We know we all learned that exports continued from Ireland whilst people starved. But from what I've read, imports coming in exceed exports going out. So we like to think this is an illustration of the nasty nature of capitalism. It may not be true in this particular case. Doesn't really change. It doesn't change anything. The point is that people were allowed to starve, and they could have been avoided through proper intervention. It didn't. But in the case of Bengal, I think it's the only example I've come across where it was actually intended to be the case, and that's the difference. So that's its particularity. So you're quite right to point out similarities. They're bound to be similar because, after all, it's the same imperialist system operating over a period of several hundred years. Why would it be any different? They share similarities, but it's the uniqueness of Bengal and the particular role of India in the British Empire which we need to focus upon. And that relationship was particularly hideous. And as a consequence, the effects were particularly hideous. So this is a market discussion. What is similar? What is different? No, the contradictions remain the same, but the contradictions are played out in different localities in different ways. And this is why the public stress the essential difference between the colonies of what they call the subtropical and tropical areas, like India and Burma and Malaysia and Africa and the Caribbean, and then the colonies of the temperate zones, United States, Australia, Canada, South Africa. These are also colonies, but their relationship to the metropolis was very different. And stressing the differences enables the partners to give an account of Bengal, which hitherto has been kind of hidden. We all know about Churchill's odious racism. We know that he was an arch imperialist. We know all that. But underneath that persona, which he projects, there are ongoing economic fiscal arrangements which the Republicans have actually unearthed. And if you read through their detailed stuff in the article Tom sent just gives you a flavour. Utsa Putnik in particular has unearthed tons of data which is trawled through records to show how this policy was put into place and how it was implemented and so on and so forth. But they have detailed and empirical evidence of this whole process, which you know is unearthing true history. You know, it's a remarkable achievement.
Okay, Surender, then Lotika, then Naeem. And Paul can answer after these three. I think so.
Sorry, I wasn't really going to say anything, actually. I was only pointing to somebody else's hand, but now that I'm speaking. So if we're arguing that famine is a sort of a strategy of imperialism that's been exercised periodically. So I'm wondering what it is that makes it such a convenient political tool to do so, to have it as such a strategy. Is it that you know, it can be blamed on so-called acts of God and stuff, so it doesn't need to be questioned so much, it can be individualized? And that, I mean, is that something relevant to talk about or not?
Well, yes, we can talk about it. Yeah.
Okay, Lotika.
Thank you. I'll leave that for Paul to answer. Yeah, and I was just going to add here that you know, this comparison of Ireland and India that you were trying to make. Yeah, and there's some similarities, but not all. So there's another author called Mick Davis. I don't know. He's written a book called Late Victorian Holocaust: The Making of the Third World, and I've seen that sometime before, but I never really got down to reading it. But the synopsis sort of says he covers three famines, Bengal in quite detail actually also, but also one in China, one in Brazil around the same time. So we're talking of late Victorian time, but he does use the word Holocaust in his title. Now I've forgotten, I've read the preface a bit also, but I've forgotten why he preferred to use the word Holocaust, though I know you said that there was a difference. So I'm just throwing this in the mix, though I'm not really, I don't know if we want to really argue about words about whether Holocaust or famine is kind of more appropriate. But he also mentioned one more thing, which was that it was more possible for more people to immigrate or emigrate from Ireland than it was from the third world countries, which is why probably there was less devastation per se in Ireland rather than there. But the other three, Brazil, the one in China also he mentioned was under in the colonial imperialist period as well. So similarities, yes, some differences, but definitely the colonial project was associated with constructed famines, which I think Amartya Sen said that famine is basically about not about distribution rather than absolute quantities of food.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. Yeah.
Okay, Naeem.
Naeem, you want to go first? Yeah.
Naeem has frozen.
Oh dear.
Naeem has gone frozen.
Wait until Naeem unfreezes. So a couple of points raised by Lotika and Surinder. Well, you said that famines are a strategy of imperialism or colonization. I don't think I would agree with that statement in terms of strategies. What I'm trying to point out is that in Bengal's case, it's a strategy. In other cases, famines occurred for lots of reasons, but they were not actually intended as a part of public policy. They are mismanaged with great callousness. People were allowed to starve to death. All those sort of things happened, and the classic case, of course, was the 1770 Bengal famine, where, although records are very imprecise, historians refer to 10 million deaths in Bengal, which would have been at the time a third of the population. In 43, the Bengali population was 60 million, of which 3 million died. So one in 20 died in Bengal in 43. In 1770, the Bengal famine 1770, which came about because of harvest failures, 10 million, 1 in 3 died. And yet again, that's due due to the rapaciousness of the British East India Company, which increased taxation many times over. People may know that after the Battle of Plassey in 1765 or thereabouts, the East India Company extracted from the emperor, the Mughal emperor, the concession to collect revenues in return to pay the Mughal emperor a certain amount of money per year. In return for that payment to the Mughal emperor, the East India Company was allowed to tax the Indian population in Bengal as high as it wanted. So to clear its debt, its annual debt to the emperor, it had every incentive to raise taxes as high as possible, which is what it did. Taxes increased 100% several times over in a short period of time, meaning that when the famine struck in Bengal for natural reasons, harvest failures, flooding, droughts, food became very short, and people were so heavily taxed they couldn't afford to buy food which is in short supply. So this, you had no example of demand management where prices rise because supply is insufficient. The East India Company did not respond to that mass starvation. It carried on ruthlessly collecting taxes through its intermediaries, and people who couldn't pay their taxes were kicked off their land and become landless and so on and so forth. So it had very similar outcomes to the Bengal Famine of 43, but the etiology, the reasons for what's happening were yet again different in terms of particularities. But going back to Lotika's point, very important points about immigration, which is one of the Putnam's key points, is that you may recall in our previous discussions, we talked about how the reserve army of labour in the metropolis was sent across to these temperate zones of colonies in America, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Canada. They were exported to these places as labour, in one sense, removing the pressure cooker effect of reserve armies in the metropolis. And in the Irish case, 1 million people died in this period. 2.5 million or more actually migrated. Had they not migrated, then maybe many more would have died. So this capacity to emigrate or to migrate to escape from starvation was an option available in these cases. The option was not available in Bengal. People did move to the cities, to Calcutta and so on and so forth, where they entered into the marginality of society. As I said, in many cases, women were forced to enter brothels, people become daily paid labour, and they lived in the slums, not the streets, and so on and so forth. So there's migration from the rural countryside to the urban centres in Bengal to some extent. But Bengali peasants couldn't migrate around the world to escape poverty. They weren't even allowed to migrate to other states or to other provinces because of their own barriers. So that option was not available to these populations. I mean, in terms of figures, I've got some figures you might be interested in. We talk about the 1770 Bengali famine under the jurisdiction of the British East India Company. Well, in 1783, there's another famine in which 11 million people died, the so-called Chalisa famine, yet again for the same reasons. There was a natural disaster, droughts and flooding, that sort of thing, poor crops, and people died, in this case 11 million. In 1779, there's the so-called Doji Bara famine, where 11 million died. In Orissa, there were 12 major famines where millions of people died during this period. So in one sense, the 1770, the 1943 famines were not unique. They were endemic to the Raj during this period of time. So clearly there's an ongoing similarity. There's a systems process there which shares similarities. Let's say the difference is in the Bengali case 43, it was an induced human-made famine. And I didn't mention this in my presentation, but for me, as a Marxist theoretician, it raises an interesting question. And that question is the role of human agency. To what extent? Now, we can talk glibly about famines being part of capitalism as a system, part of imperialism as a system, but it seems to me that in many cases, human agency plays a very important part. Supposing Churchill had not forbidden the import of millions of tons of grain, as he did, would that make a difference? People like Keynes and other people came up with this idea about how to pay for a war. These are human ideas. In other words, supposing Keynes not been around at the time, would there have been a different outcome? So this, to me, poses an interesting question about human agency in the unfolding of history. We've had this debate on many occasions and people have strong views about it, but I think the Bengal famine makes this point very crystal clear, a point of contention. To what extent do humans actually cause things to happen directly, consciously, or not? A big Marxist debate, so maybe people got a view on that. Yeah.
Naim has disappeared. Last time when I called, his connection got disconnected. This time he has disappeared.
His room is empty.
All right, can I come back then?
Yeah.
Since Naim's not available immediately.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced. I'm just not convinced that we can, from the evidence that we've got, that we can say that this was a deliberately engineered famine in Bengal in the 1940. Partly because I don't understand the economics of what the article is saying, but as I understand it from the way that it comes across, the rise in prices was due to the quartering of, particularly of the quartering of Allied troops in Bengal, and the creation of a war industry in Bengal in order to put up some kind of shield against the Japanese coming from Burma. So that, I think, if that's the reason for the rise in prices, then that's not a deliberate policy to rise prices. It's a deliberate policy to put the troops there. It's a deliberate policy to make India pay for that, rather than paying for it from the coffers of the imperialist country. But it's the actual rise in prices leading to the famine is incidental to the decision to put the troops there in the first place and then to make India pay for it. The important thing for the Patnaiks is their theory that the essence of imperialism is forcing consumption down in the third world countries, the global south, and so on and so forth. And this is an example of which they're saying contributes to that theory. Now that may be right, but I certainly haven't been convinced from what my reading of the article and from what we've said here today that that is a definite example of that, and that it was a deliberate famine, a deliberately orchestrated famine. Although it's certainly a totally avoidable one, in terms, leave alone Churchill, even they could have found other ways of paying for the US and UK troops in Bengal. They could have found ways of bringing food in from Bihar or from Punjab. When the prices were too high, they could have set up a central food store to distribute food to the peasantry and made sure that they didn't happen. All that, so it's totally totally avoidable famine. But to go as far as to say it was deliberately engineered, I think I would need more convincing.
Okay. I think they actually, well, I didn't go to in great depth because it is rather technical. Is a bit which you find rather obtuse, but it's linked to the fact that there's a deliberate policy of what's called monetarizing the whole process. So that there's a deliberate policy of printing money, which leads to inflation. It's a deal with the so-called Reserve Bank of India, where this money extracted from the Indian economy was deposited, but it's inaccessible. So I can understand your reservations because I haven't explained very well, or didn't even try to explain very well, the fiscal policy behind it. So to confirm your understanding and your view about it, we need to go into much more detail about this fiscal policy and how it actually operated, which we can't do today. I mean, it's very technical. So yes, I can appreciate from your perspective, given what we've said, it might just be this is an unfortunate consequence as opposed to an intended one. But the Putniks are arguing very strongly because they're trained economists. They're arguing that it was indeed intentional, knowing very well this have the consequences. From what we said today, I think your perspective is a valid one. We'd have to go into much more detail and have a shared understanding of the economics involved, which we probably don't have as a group. I mean, can you explain, Tom, in simple words, how can you disavow James of his understanding? No. You're an economist. You get paid to teach economics. Come on.
Yeah, I suggest that I will read that book and I will come back to you.
Okay, good.
But
yeah.
I know that from my reading of Keynes, I have only teaching Keynes's general theory.
Yeah.
And also Keynes has changed his ideas over the years. And Churchill had said, when two economics are there in a room, there will be two opinions. Unless Lord Keynes is there, in that case, there will be three. And then Keynes replied that when I get new data, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? So when writing after the First World War, when they imposed a very huge fine on Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, Keynes had opposed it, and he had predicted this will lead to another war.
Yeah.
So at that time, he opposed imposing fines on the people. Yeah. So he has taken a different view. You are suggesting. First is Mary Wilkins.
Mary's got a question.
Mary,
I don't think but it is related to what James said.
Yes.
So just in relation to what James said, I don't see what would be gained by setting out to kill 3 million people. I can see that they didn't give a shit if they had killed 3 million people, but what is to be gained? And it seems to me that when earlier, Paul, you talked about Lebensraum, that is a very, very clear policy. We want this land, there's people on it, so if we starve them to death, the land will be, inverted commas, empty, and we can take it. Now that seems to be very intentional with a clear logic, even though it's the most appallingly evil logic you could imagine. But but with James, I can't see what's to be gained from setting out deliberately to kill 3
No, it was clear.
Bengalis for no particular reason.
They didn't set out to kill Bengalis. They set out policies which would kill Bengalis. So
I think that's the difference, isn't it? It's a consequence that was foreseen rather than an end in itself.
No, it wasn't an end in itself. It's a means to an end. So this is very important. So maybe I didn't make myself clear. The policy they introduced in India was a means to an end, not an end itself. And as with Lebensraum, which was a means to an end, the means to an end in India was for the British to defeat Japan. Their objective was to defeat Japan. That was the end outcome they're looking for, a war against another imperialist power. That took their priority. The means to that defeat of Japan was to put in place a set of policies to enable them to defeat Japan, so they were successful, but the consequence was, knowingly, that it would lead to starvation, just like the Nazis knew that Lebensraum would lead to the death of millions of Slavs. In this case, they knew very well that this would unavoidably lead to the deaths of millions of Bengalis. So they didn't intend to, they weren't in a sense bloodthirsty, wanting to destroy a population. They thought that population was surplus to requirements in terms of the end result. They could be sacrificed. That's the best way to get a result against Japan. Don't forget, got to the Indian border. The best result to defeat their arch imperial rival, Japan, was to put in place a set of policies which had the consequence of killing millions of Bengalis. They didn't want to kill Bengalis, but they didn't care less that would happen. So in that sense, it was intentional. You see the difference?
I think that point's really important, because you got to bring in the war here as well then, because the war in that part of India was very crucial to the winning of the Second World War by the Allied forces. Actually, a lot of that gets missed because a lot of focus is on the Second World War, tends to ignore the the contribution of that part of the world in terms of even the numbers of soldiers who went from there. I mean, the whole volunteer Indian army that went from India and took part in the war, even in Europe or in North Africa, but also that area of the northeast of India and Bengal was very crucial to winning of the war. So it was very important to win that part of the war. And that's why sacrificing, so there's quite a few links in there, and it becomes more complicated, like Paul said, probably needs a bigger discussion, where there's also that, Patnaik, when I heard her, she mentioned also that, there was a lot of opposition by the trade unions when Keynes first raised this thing about we'll need more taxation to raise more money and all. And there's no way we are prepared, we are fighting the war and all, but we are not going to agree to this increase in inflation. So now with my apologies to economists, but there has been a tendency of some economists at least to not consider too many social elements. You stick to the maths, and because we know that in Manchester some time back the students were arguing, why are we learning this theory if when the 2008 downturn happened, they were questioning what are we learning. So I guess Keynes may have partly been like that, but there's also the inherent entitlement of racism in that period, which, like Paul said, that decision would have been made. Somebody has to be sacrificed, they can go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interestingly, just to pick up this point, is that in British folklore, of course, about the war, so you're describing the Eurocentric vision of the war, is that even in the British context, the army in Burma was called the Forgotten Army. It was called the Forgotten Army. So that sector of the war, which was very important, as you say, I mean, Americans, British, and other soldiers from other parts of the empire came in, and so many Indian soldiers recruited also to fight that war, who lost their lives, and even Chinese soldiers joined the Allies there against Japan. So it's a big theatre of war, and it is very expensive. The Indian budget increased many times over, 8 times, 10 times over above the normal budget. And that budget had to be paid for. It's paid for by printing money. That led to inflation, led to starvation. So to just pick up Mary's point, there wasn't a purpose to kill 3 million people. Who would even know how to count the possibilities? The 3 million just is, in one sense, a contingency of circumstance. The point was that there's a higher objective to achieve in imperialist terms: defeat this opposing imperialist force on the gates of India. And the way to do it was the way that it unfolded in Bengal. But it illustrates that in terms, because you're an Indian and you're Bengali, you're not white, it means you can be sacrificed willy-nilly. So when we talk about intentionality, we have to build into that mindset a kind of racialized concept of the world. Some people are less valued than others. So when you're looking at consequences, you bring into play your notions of value, don't you? So in that broader sense, it's intentional as well. No one sat down, in Calcutta saying, right, we've got this problem. I know what, let's kill 3 million Bengalis, that'll solve the problem. No one said that. The point is that they went for a mindset process of how to achieve their objectives with a minimum of cost to Britain in a metropolis, without all the social instability which would have risen in Britain had Britain itself paid for the war in Bengal and Burma. As you point out, Keynes is very concerned that getting the British public to pay for the war through increased taxation, so on and so forth, would have led to vast, wide-scale social unrest, and the trade unions dead against it. Here's an example, going back to my earlier points. So the trade union movement colluded with the imperial authorities at the expense of their erstwhile colleagues in Bengal. Another example of trade union collusion with the ruling class. If you look at and Putnick suggests that there could have been a fairly cost-free alternative to what happened, and going back to Luttiger's point about doing the maths, the Putnicks have worked out that had the British public been taxed an extra £5 a year, so the average income, as she points out, in 1940s, the average income was £105 a year. That's what people earned, average income. It's about £2 a week. My father, when he started, my father was in the war. He was demobbed in 1947, and in his first job as a railway porter, he earned £2 a week. £2 a week. That's the average wage in the 40s, in 1943, £2 a week. The average income is £105 a year, and had £5 that had been taxed in Britain to pay for the war in India, this needn't have happened in Bengal. There's a decision not to tax the population of Britain. It decided to make the Indians pay themselves. So this is what we mean by intentionality, setting a course of action, something which was avoidable and unnecessary, but it is a choice made. So when you make choices, that applies to the intentionality. You look at a choice, as other choices, you choose one choice, you're aware of the consequences, nonetheless, you proceed down that road. And in that sense, you can argue that Bengal was a genocide.
Okay, Naeem, sorry for holding you for a long time. After that, we shall
Yeah,
have a discussion.
I don't know whether it's worth making my points at this late stage, but I mean, I think I would say one thing is that, famines are blamed on natural causes, but in fact, really, famines are a result of political and economic exploitation. And I think imperialism had a great deal to do with the famines that took place in India, certainly in the 18th and the 19th century. And they were as a direct consequence of super exploitation. That means extraction of surplus value well above what people can afford. And I think that was the main reason for the famines in India. And I think the famines in India in 1772 were as drastic and as draconian as people suggest, because when we were looking in 2007, 150 years of the first war of independence, we looked at quite a lot of material that was available and written from the time. And one of the things that came out quite clearly was that the East India Company, its main profits were derived from the taxes that were raised in India. And in fact, the director's reports at the time said that while there was a huge famine in India, which was killing so many people, people were dying in streets, we increased our taxes in that same period. And that was one of the reasons. And I think the reasons why natural causes do affect the growth and the agriculture and everything else, but the basis of why famines don't happen, even despite those natural causes, is because taxation helps you to prevent against those. And in India, that was not done. Under the Mughals, it was said that the canals and the irrigation system was kept clean and the money was invested in there. But when Britain took over the ruling of India, that money stopped being spent in India. It actually came to England. And that was the reason for the famines, not the natural causes. And the other thing was that it is a well-known thing in terms of, people are afraid of the railways in India because the railways came and took your surplus grain. So people in the villages were left without food in cases of emergencies, like the famines or the natural causes or the natural conditions that will cause them. So I think that was one thing. The other thing is also imperialism forced farmers to do cash crops. So I think the whole idea that without imperialism there would not have been these famines in India. I mean, the same applies to the famine in the Second World War, but the ones that actually took place in the 18th century and the 19th century were really, their impact on the population was huge. And I think it may be true that a third of the population of Bengal would have been wiped out in those famines. So I think it could have been that drastic. So I think it is the extraction of the surplus value under imperialism that is the cause. And I mean, even famines that are happening today, if it wasn't for the relationships of neoliberalism and everything else, we probably would not see them as famines because people would be able to cope with those. What imperialism does is exploits it to such an extent that any disaster leaves you vulnerable. And I think that is what we need to understand, I think.
Okay, then.
Interesting, but I come across one interesting fact about the Bengal famine is that under the local laws regarding famine relief, because they had lots of famines, once a province like Bengal, once its government declared a state of famine, they were obliged by law to intervene and provide relief. And what happened was that they made a decision not to invoke that famine clause until far too late. In other words, they denied there's a famine going on until well into the famine itself. So there's an example of callousness to avoid expenditure. And this has happened in other places, not to declare a state of famine, which then triggers a constitutional response enshrined in law, is a good old trick. You delay announcing this clause until you're well into the famine. There's been many examples of that in other parts of the world, including those ones you're describing much earlier. So,
Okay, then we shall wind up now. Thank you very much.
Can I just make one announcement?
Just 1 minute. Let me stop.